Thanks all. So my name is Alex Karlets. I'm the solutions architect here at StarWind. So our topic today will be the open source. What it is, what open source storage products are worth looking at. So yeah, like nowadays, lots of people such as system administrators, engineers, even home laborers search for the software solution that will not only meet their requirement, it will also have minimal impact in terms of costs. So looking at all these prices, vendors share customers. In some cases, that's not acceptable at all. So people starting to look at open source free options available. So yeah, like I'm pretty sure that every single one of you guys heard of open source software. What is the open source? What's under the hood? Practically speaking, open source software is a decentralized model to develop software in which the copyright holders of such software allow the code to be reviewed, changed, and redistributed for any purpose. In example, commercially, under open source or free licenses. Not to be confused with shared source, where the source code is simply allowed to be viewed and in some cases modified. In contrast, the proprietary software that is licensed is typically provided closed source as a compiled or binary format. In some cases, it can be provided open source to the customer with the note that any modification to the code automatically becomes the intellectual property of the licenser. So these details are typically governed by an end user license agreement, EULA, in which the license allows the individual or company adopting such software to be used but not owned as a part of their final product. If programmer intends to modify proprietary storage source code and like include that code in his product, he must be sure to review in detail the EULA for the particular software. Okay, so back to open source, there are several criteria of the open source software to be met. It must have free redistribution and contain source code as well as a compiled form. The source code must be the preferred form in which a programmer would modify the program. The license must explicitly permit distribution of software built from modified source code, and it must not discriminate against any person of group or persons, as well as not restrict anyone from making use of the program in a specific field of endeavor. So the rights attached to the program must apply to all to whom the program is redistributed without need for execution of additional license by those parties. In addition, the license must not place restrictions on other software that is distributed along with the licensed software, as well as it must be technology neutral. This means that no provision of the license may be predicated on any individual technology or style of interface. Now, what about the history of open source? So, in general, the entity of open source appeared in early mid-70s. It started simply from those hobbyists and academics from all over the world who developed the software, which was completely free. So having ARPANET set up worldwide network, the collaboration between coders greatly increased as they could exchange the code between each other. After the world entered 90s, and with Linux arrival in 1991, the open source became important for enterprises and proved a better, faster way to develop core software technologies. So like with more and more foundational open source technologies, open source communities and enterprises began to experiment with commercialization. In 1998, the Open Software Initiative coined the term open source, and around the time, the first real business model emerged with Red Hat, MySQL, and many others doing paid support and services on top of free software. This was the first time we saw a viable economic model to support the development of these organizations. The other thing notable at this time was the value of open source companies paled in comparison to their proprietary counterparts. So when we look at Red Hat versus Microsoft, MySQL versus Oracle, like XenSource versus VMware, the value of the closed source company was so much greater than the open source counterpart. So the industry deemed open source software a commodity that could never realize anywhere near the potential economic value of proprietary company. And by the mid 2000s, those valuations started to shift, basically. So the cloud computing opened the aperture and allowed companies to run open source software as a service, SaaS. Once developer can host an open source service in the cloud, the user does not know or care if there is open source or proprietary software under the hood, leading to similar valuations of open source and proprietary companies, and indicating that open source that like really has real economic and strategic value. So basically the history of open source highlights that its rise is due to virtuous cycle of technology and business innovation. On the technical side, open source is the best way to create software because it speeds product feedback and innovation. It improves the software reliability, it scales support, drives adoption, and like pulls technical talent. So open source was technologically driven model, and these traits have been there since the free software era. So what principles does the open source community stand on? There are several principles open source community follows, because if there are no principles at all, I believe like there is no community, just the anarchy. So the first one is transparency. Whether people developing software or solving a business problem, everyone has access to the information and materials necessary for doing people's best work. And when these materials are accessible, people can build upon each other's ideas and discoveries. So they can make more effective decisions and understand how decisions affect them. Also, there's collaboration principle. When people are free to participate, they can enhance each other's work in anticipated ways. When people can modify what others have started, have shared, they unlock new possibilities. And by initiating new projects together, people can solve problems that no one can solve alone. And when they implement open standards, they enable others to contribute in the future. So the third principle is like release early and often. So just because rapid prototypes can lead to rapid discoveries, an iterative approach leads to better solutions faster. So when you're free to experiment, you can look at problems in new ways and seek answers in new places, so you can learn by doing. Another one is meritocracy. So good ideas can come from anywhere, and the best ideas should win. Only by including diverse perspectives in our conversations can people be certain they've identified the best ideas, and decision makers continually seek those perspectives. So people may not operate by consensus, but successful work determines which projects gather support and effort from the community. And I believe the last one and the main one is the community principle. So communities form when different people unite around a common purpose. So shared values guide decision making, and community goals supersede the individual interests and agendas. However, sometimes the community principles are being ignored when the company claims the API of the open source products and says that since now you need to pay money to use this API. For example, Oracle versus Linux case. So the well-known programmer and apparently owner of Linux operating system, Linus Torvalds, has warned users of Linux not to use an Oracle file system because of possible legal actions. So the file system called ZFS was built by Sun Microsystems, which has since been acquired by Oracle. So Torvalds wrote in one of the online forums on January 6th that he does not feel safe in adding ZFS code to the Linux project because of Oracle's tendency to file lawsuits against other companies, including an ongoing legal brawl between Google and Oracle. So, yeah, like other people think it can be okay to merge ZFS code into the kernel, and that the module interface makes it okay, and that's their decision. Torvalds wrote, but considering Oracle's litigious nature and the questions over licensing, there is no way I can feel safe in ever doing so. So, like in reference, Oracle's lawsuit against Google, which is over stealing Java technology for Google's Android system and could cost Google as much as like $9 billion, is set to go to the Supreme Court this year. So Google at the press conference and its supporters in the case have argued that an Oracle victory in this case would have a chilling effect on software innovation. So yeah, that happens sometimes. Okay, so what about the support approach of the open source software? Does the community support it well? So the open source community is diverse and highly motivated. And speaking about the support of the open source projects, everything goes through the community. So there are actually two options here. The first one is through community support. You use the open source product if you have any questions, improvement, etc. You go chatting with people that are aware of this product. And using the Hive mind, the product can be improved or fixed or clarified, so on. Another support model is the commercial open source, one we have here on the diagram. So it's still being built on the community fundamental. However, it gets an additional layer between users and community, which can be service providers, for example, like Red Hat. There is an open source project being created by core developers. Core devs bring contributions to community, such as software itself, its roadmap, design. Then community improves the software and gives it to service provider. That performs prioritization of the project and gives the finished product to end users, customers. Then the service provider gathers resources from the end users, and if there are questions arise, goes back to community with some contributions. So in its turn, the community analyzes the contributions and makes its own contributions to core developers. These can be use cases, testing, bug fixes, documentations, features, etc. So the devs can also improve the project. Whatever the support model is, the core will be always the community. Okay, so now probably you guys want to hear about what to expect from using open source products, but wait a minute. So I'm pretty sure that this step room would be a kind of waste of time without us mentioning open source storage solutions. That's why we're all here. And as I work at StarWind Storage Virtualization Company, and you all, ladies and gentlemen, at least are subscribed to StarWind newsletter. So there are many open source software-defined storage as well as backup solutions on the market today. So let's find out who they are. The first and the most interesting for me personally is Ceph. I was playing with it in my home lab, great product. However, it is complicated product that requires decent amount of time to understand the principles of work. So uh, basically, Ceph is an open source software-defined distributed file system, missing bottlenecks and single points of failure, which generally a cluster of nodes that can be easily scalable to petabyte sizes, performing various functions, providing data storage and replication, as well as load balancing, which ensures high availability and reliability. So the system is free, although developers can provide paid support. No special equipment is required also. So if any drive node or group of nodes fails, Ceph will not only ensure data safety, but will also restore the lost copies on other nodes until the failed nodes of disks are replaced with working ones. At the same time, the rebuild occurs without second downtime and is transparent for customers. So another good product is OpenStack. It offers complete operating system for controlling compute, networking, and storage in the cloud. It also incorporates three sub-projects related to the storage, which are Cinder, Swift, and Manila. So OpenStack also offers sample configurations based on OpenStack case studies and real-world reference architectures across workloads and industries. So users can use these to figure out which configuration will work best for their environment. And the third SDS product, in my opinion, worth mentioning is GlusterFS. So it is a software-defined storage that is a layer that sits on top of traditional local storage mount points, allowing the aggregation of storage space between multiple nodes into single storage entity or storage cluster. So the GlusterFS can run on shelf commodity hardware to public, private, or hybrid clouds, although its primary usage is file storage, NAS, network attached storage. Several plugins allow it to be used as backend for block storage, though the cluster block through the cluster block plugin and for object storage with cluster Swift plugin. Some of main features that define GlusterFS are as follows: no single point of failure, scalability, asynchronous job replication, performance, self-healing, and flexibility. So among the backup products of open source, I'm quite familiar with the next. So the first one is the handy command line tool for backing up the data to cloud is rclone. It allows to synchronize the data between the cloud storage and local machine. One of its main advantages is lots of operating system supports, starting from Linux, Windows, up to OpenBSD, Solaris, and Plan 9. For a free open source solution that provides a GUI. If you don't feel comfortable with command line, you can take a look at Duplicati. So Duplicati is also an open source free backup software to use for creating encrypted backups online for Windows, macOS, and Linux operating systems. So it requires Net Framework 4.5 or Mono, and it works with standard protocols like FTP, WebDAV, SSH, and is compatible to use with Microsoft OneDrive, Amazon Cloud Service, and S3, Box.com, Google Drive, many others. So it handles network issues efficiently. Moreover, Duplicati uses strong AES 256 encryption to protect your privacy. And the product is licensed under lesser general public license. So that's also great. Now, finally, I wanted to share a bit that like what to expect from the open source software in general. So definite plus is that there are little to no upfront costs of open source software. You just need to download the code from a legitimate source and you're good to go. If you're on a tight budget, it might be a good idea to go open source instead of breaking the bank for costly solutions. After all, free stuff is always good, right? But no initial cost doesn't mean that there aren't any, which leads us to our first argument against it. So at the same time, there is a long-term costs may arise. If any problem occurs that needs immediate attention, it's up to you to put out the fire and those costs. So you can't choke your vendor's throat to fix the issue because there is none. Instead, you have to either deal with it in-house or hire external help. So also consider the costs of the implementation and staff training associated with introducing new software in the office. So that's the dark side of the open source. So like the open source is flexible. Users of open source software benefit from the freedom to modify the software in a way that suits their business needs. So like unlike with commercial software where you have to stick to the vendor's requirements and limits, open source users have complete control over their software. Also, open source is reliable. Because usually thousands of expert developers work on making and constantly improving the open source software. This means that there is a greater chance that someone will notice a flaw or a bug and fix it in no time. Another pair of eyes is always a plus, or in particular case, hundreds of thousands of eyes. At the same time, there is always a possibility that the developers of a program lose interest in working further on the software or just move to another project. This being said, both open source and proprietary software can be discontinued for whatever reason. So the open source advocates assert that open source software is is more secure overall compared to the proprietary software, just because bugs and other issues tend to be dealt with as soon as they are caught by the community members. On the other hand, this is not the case with commercial software. Larger enterprises can take weeks or months to deal with vulnerabilities and issues and issue fix. However, open source software is not developed in a controlled environment. So with hundreds of developers working on the software, there is a chance that some of them could have malicious intentions. All it takes for a disaster is a single programmer to incorporate some malware into the software. in the case of closed software, only the vendor developers can see and edit the source code. That's why closed software is seen as safer, although the risk of hidden backdoor Trojans is always the possibility. So the community support, it's definitely the advantage of the open source software. And if people are familiar with the software you use, moreover, they are keen to improve it or help with any question, the result of such collaboration will be the great software to use. At the same time, if you don't ready to collaborate with the open source software community, or again, if the community loses the interest to this project, you are on your own with the problems you have. So with all these expectations, taking a look into open source software history, does it worth considering? My personal point of view is, yeah, definitely it's worth looking at. However, if you need to, you need to understand for you, are you ready to support this project personally? Just because when you use the open source software, you become the member of the community. So in fact, you accept the rules and take the responsibilities of having the product live and prosper. So yeah, like now, I believe it's time for your questions. I'm sure you have some. So you can simply type them in the chat. Okay, I see the first question. Mark Pierce asks, what about StarWind? Do you guys use the open source software? I believe I'm not responsible to answer such questions. Obviously, I'm not the developer. However, like, yes, the open source implementation. For example, we use Linux operating system to deliver our StarWind for vSphere in a form of template. So technically, the answer is yes. Andy Jones asks, could you please share details on vSAN for vSphere pricing? Well, you can simply contact our sales team and ask for pricing using contact form on our website. I believe they are in touch with this. I'm not so familiar with pricing. I'm more like familiar with the tech questions and tech part of storage world. As far as I can see, there are no more questions so far. So let's just wait a couple of minutes. Maybe there are like complicated questions arising. So Eric Q asks, StarWind vSAN guide for Linux is available? Yeah, for sure. So we have the complete installation guide for StarWind Virtual SAN Linux edition. So you can find it on our official website, and it's in the list of tech papers. So Yurina asks, what about the plans of ZFS implementation in StarWind products? So as far as I remember from the roadmap we have within StarWind, there's no information regarding ZFS, but from some people I heard that there are some kind of work on it. So not in the nearest future, I believe in 1 or 2 years it can be available. Eric Q asks, I thought I could find it on your website, but I cannot find it. So you can simply contact one of our sales guys and they will be simply glad to send all the guides we have regarding Linux implementation of StarWind. No worries, you can even ask about the guides on our official YouTube channel or in chat just. Okay, so are we still have any questions, or will this webinar be available to view later? Yes, of course. So we have our every webinar to be recorded, and usually it takes up to one week for our webinar to appear on our official YouTube channel as well as on the official site. So yeah. Yeah, like I see that there are no more questions so far. However, you can always ask them later on our social media. This step room will be available, as I mentioned previously, on our official YouTube channel next week. Okay, one more question. Eric Q asks, honestly, I did contact several times when I evaluated it, but no one responded. I hope supports are better now. Wish you all best and healthy. Thank you, Eric. So depending on actually what you're trying to test, if you just go with the free license, you can use our forum support. But yeah, like you can simply contact our chat and we'll be able to help you with pretty much any question. Okay, so I'm gonna thank you all for attending this webinar. It was my pleasure to shed some light on the open source software approach to all of you. Take care and fly safe. Have a great rest of the day. So, goodbye.